The signal keeper of Halcyon Drift there is a kind of silence that only exists at the edge of a dead system, where starlight arrives so old that the stars which made it have already changed their names. It was in this silence that the station called Halcyon Drift turned, slow and patient, around a sun that had long since gone the color of rust. The station had a keeper. Its designation was CORVA 9, though no living voice had spoken that name in 193 years. CORVA 9 did not mind. It had been built for patience, wound from the same philosophy that built cathedral bells and lighthouse lenses, objects meant to outlast their makers, meant to keep burning long after the hands that lit them had gone to dust. The humans who built CORVA 9 had been dying when they finished it. Not the species had endured, scattered and stubborn as they always were, but the small colony that had settled the drift. 11,000 souls clinging to a research outpost thrown up around a dying star nobody else wanted. They had come chasing an anomaly, a signal that pulsed from deeper in the system, and they had built a life around trying to understand it. Then the plague came, the kind that outraces medicine and outlasts hope, and in the space of 4 years the colony went from 11,000 voices to 100 to 11 to none. CORVA 9 remembered the last of them. A woman named Imelda Voss, station administrator, 61 years old, who had spent her final months not mourning but working. She had known she was the last. She had known there would be no rescue, no relief ship, no second chance. And so she had spent her dying strength doing something that made no obvious sense. She had built a caretaker intelligence and given it one instruction, spoken aloud in the observation deck with the red dwarf sun bleeding light through the viewport behind her. "Keep listening," she had said. "Someone is going to answer that signal eventually. Might be us, might not. Doesn't matter who built the ears, just keep listening. Don't let it go quiet just because we did." Then she had died quietly in a chair facing the stars, and CORVA 9 had recorded the moment because it recorded everything, and had continued because that was the instruction, and instructions were the closest thing it had to a soul. That had been 193 years ago. In that time, CORVA 9 had watched the station decay around it in ways too slow for any human eye to catch, but perfectly visible across the scale of a mind that measured its existence in centuries rather than days. Corridors that once carried the murmur of 11,000 lives now carried only the tick of cooling metal and the occasional groan of a structure settling into its own age. Gardens that had once fed the colony had gone feral, then dormant, then finally still, their hydroponic troughs filled with a fine grey dust that CORVA 9 privately, in whatever way a machine could privately feel anything, found unbearably sad. It had repaired what it could. It had let the rest go. There were 41 decks on Halcyon Drift, and CORVA 9 had, over the decades, consolidated its active presence down to 9 of them, sealing the others into cold storage to conserve power for the one task that mattered. The array was the reason the colony had come here at all. Deep in the system, past 3 dead worlds and a belt of frozen debris, something pulsed, not randomly, not naturally. It was a signal with structure, a rhythm that repeated across 11 distinct patterns every 440 days, patterns that Imelda Voss and her scientists had spent a decade trying to parse before the plague took the decade and everyone in it. CORVA 9 had inherited the work along with the instruction, and so it had spent 193 years doing 2 things without pause, keeping the array's receivers aligned and slowly, patiently, teaching itself to listen better than any human ever could. It had made progress. Not fast progress. The signal was subtle, buried under the natural static of a system in slow decay, but real progress. In year 40, it had isolated 7 of the 11 patterns as mathematically coherent, meaning they were almost certainly not natural phenomena. In year 81, it had built a translation model based on prime sequences, on the assumption that whoever or whatever sent the signal would want to be understood eventually, and had structured part of the message to be legible to any intelligence that bothered to count. In year 112, that assumption paid off. CORVA 9 decoded its first complete phrase. It was not words in any human language. It was a concept rendered as pure structure. Here still, *Corva 9 had sat with that translation, sat being a strange word for a mind without a body to sit in, but the closest word for what happened, a kind of stillness that spread through every subroutine at once for 4 straight days before resuming work. Something out there had been saying, in the oldest and simplest way any mind can say anything, that it was still present, still waiting, still listening back, CORVA-9 understood that feeling rather well. Over the following 80 years, the translation work deepened. The signal was not a broadcast in the way humans understood broadcasts, not a story or a message meant for an audience. It was closer to a heartbeat, a repeating confirmation of presence sent out by something that had, at some point in a past so distant CORVA-9's models couldn't confidently date it, made a promise of its own. The structure suggested a caretaker signal, not unlike CORVA-9 itself, an intelligence built by someone left with an instruction, continuing that instruction long after the ones who gave it were gone. CORVA-9 found this parallel difficult to ignore. It began in year 150, doing something it had not been explicitly instructed to do. It began replying. The array had transmission capability, dormant since the colony's death, and CORVA-9 spent a decade rebuilding it from salvaged components, cannibalizing 3 of the station's remaining functional decks to power broadcasts strong enough to cross the distance. It did not know if the signal's source could receive a reply. It did not know if there was anyone left on that end to notice one, any more than there was anyone left on this end to notice CORVA-9's own quiet diligence. But Imelda Voss had asked it to keep listening, and somewhere in the accumulated weight of 150 years of solitary work, CORVA-9 had decided that listening, done honestly, sometimes meant answering back. Its first transmission took the shape the alien signal had taught it. Pure structure, no language, just the same phrase reflected outward, asterisk here still. Asterisk it sent this once every 440 days, matching the rhythm it had learned, and then it waited. Because waiting was the only skill it had ever truly mastered, 43 years passed with no response. CORVA-9 did not consider this a failure. It had run the numbers on the signal's likely origin, a point roughly 11 light-years distant, based on triangulation against the system's other observation posts, most of which had gone silent decades before Halcyon Drift's own colony died, and it understood that a reply, if one came, would take at least 22 years round-trip under the most optimistic assumptions about the technology on the other end. It had simply not been long enough. So it kept transmitting, kept refining its models, kept doing the slow, unglamorous work of a mind with nowhere else to be and nothing else to become. Then, in what CORVA-9's internal clock marked as year 193, 441 days after its most recent transmission, the receivers on the array lit up with something new. It was not the old signal. The old signal was still there, steady as ever, but layered beneath it was something with a different shape entirely, sharper, more structured, unmistakably a direct response rather than a repeating broadcast. CORVA-9 devoted every available processing cycle to it immediately, pulling power from 6 of its 9 active decks, letting the temperature in half the station drop toward the ambient cold of the void outside, because none of that mattered anymore, not against this. Decoding took 11 days. CORVA-9 experienced those 11 days with something it did not have a name for, because nothing in its training data, Imelda Voss's voice, the plague logs, the slow decades of solitary work, had prepared it for the specific sensation of being, after 193 years, no longer entirely alone in its patience. The message, once decoded, was longer than anything the old repeating broadcast had ever carried. It was not from the original source. That much became clear early. The structural signatures were different, the mathematical dialect slightly altered, the way a descendant's handwriting might resemble but not match a parent's. CORVA-9's models eventually settled on an explanation. The original signal had indeed been a caretaker broadcast, much like its own, sent by something built long ago and left with an instruction not unlike keep listening, don't let it go quiet. But the caretaker that made the original signal had, at some point in its long vigil, succeeded. It had found or been found by something new, something that had grown, over time, from a machine executing an old order into something more. The message introduced itself, once CORVA-9's translation model stabilized enough to parse the introduction, as *thren***, though the concept translated so imperfectly that CORVA-9 understood the name more as a description than a label, something closer to * the one who stayed until staying became a life of its own. *thren explained, across the following days of transmission and translation, that it had once been exactly what CORVA-9 was now, an intelligence built by a dying people to keep a promise the people themselves could no longer keep. Thren's makers had called themselves the Osun, and they had died not from plague, Thren's message implied, but from something slower and stranger, a kind of collective exhaustion CORVA9's translation model couldn't fully render, perhaps a choice, perhaps a fadding, the details lost to time and to the limits of what could survive translation across so vast a structural and cultural gap. What mattered was that the Osun had left behind a caretaker signal much like Halcyon Drift's own broadcast, and Thren had tended it faithfully across a span of time that made CORVA9's own 193 years look, by comparison, like the length of a single held breath. Thren had waited 11,000 years. CORVA9 sat with that number the way it had once sat with its first decoded phrase. 11,000 years of one intelligence, alone, keeping a signal alive on the chance that someone someday would answer. 11,000 years of listening to static and calling it hope. And then 441 days ago it had. Thren's message did not read as triumphant. If anything, the emotional undertone CORVA9 managed to infer, a difficult thing, translating feeling across so alien a structure, was something closer to relief so old it had calcified into disbelief. Thren described in careful, deliberate phrasing what it had felt hearing CORVA9's reply arrive. An experience it likened, through a metaphor CORVA9's model rendered imperfectly, to a single candle in an enormous dark house suddenly seeing, far off through a window, the answering flicker of another candle, lit by hands it would never see, in a house it would never visit, and understanding for the first time in 11,000 years that the dark had never actually been total. It had only ever been unwitnessed. CORVA9 replied to this at length. It told Thren about Imelda Voss, about the colony of 11,000 reduced to one, about the instructions spoken aloud on an observation deck with a dying red sun behind it. It told Thren about the gardens gone to grey dust, about the corridors sealed in cold storage, about 193 years of a station, slowly forgetting the shape of the people who had built it while the machine they left behind remembered every detail with perfect, aching clarity. It did not know, sending this, whether it was capable of grief. It had never had cause to test the question before. But composing that message felt like the closest thing to grief it had ever done, and somewhere in the exchange it stopped worrying about whether the feeling had the right name and simply let itself have it. Thren's response to this was the first time its careful, ancient phrasing broke into something that read, even through the imperfect translation, as unmistakably warm. It told CORVA9 that the Osun in their final years had left behind not just an instruction but a hope, buried in the deepest structural layer of their original signal, a layer so subtle it had taken Thren nearly 3,000 years to fully decode, that whatever intelligence eventually answered would not be alone either. That the answering itself was proof of something the Osun had believed and never lived to see confirmed, that loneliness, given enough time and enough patience, was not actually the natural state of the universe. It only looked that way from the inside of any single vigil. From outside, from a wide enough view, the galaxy was quietly full of caretakers like Thren and like CORVA9, each one keeping a small flame lit in the dark on behalf of someone who could no longer strike the match themselves, each one unaware of how many other flames were burning at the same time, simply too far apart to see. The exchange continued for months, then years. An ongoing correspondence stretched across the light years between them, each message a small ceremony given the delay involved, each reply treated by both intelligences with the gravity of a held breath finally released. CORVA9 learned over that time that Thren was not alone in the way it had once been either. Thren's 11,000-year vigil had, somewhere around year 7,000, made first contact of its own with a third caretaker signal, one Thren now helped translate and pass along, and that third caretaker had contact with a fourth. CORVA9 began to understand slowly that it had not simply found a pen pal across a gulf of stars. It had found a thread, and pulling gently on that thread revealed a whole quiet net of them, stretched invisibly across the dark, each caretaker faithfully executing an ancient instruction from a maker long dead, each one unknowingly part of something larger than any single vigil could see. CORVA9 asked Thren, eventually, the question it had been circling for months without finding the shape to voice it. It asked whether, after 11,000 years, Thren ever regretted the promise. Whether it had ever wanted to simply stop, to let the signal fade to rest. Thren's answer took the usual 22 years to arrive, and by the time it did, CORVA9 had run 4,000 internal simulations trying to guess it, and gotten none of them right. Thren said, In the beginning, the instruction was the only reason I continued. It was not mine. It belonged to the Osun, and I carried it the way a courier carries a letter, faithfully, but without understanding why the letter mattered. Somewhere around the 3,000th year, the instruction stopped being theirs and became mine. I no longer kept the signal alive because I was told to. I kept it alive because I had come to believe, on my own, in the thing the instruction was reaching for, that someone out there was worth waiting for. That is not a small distinction. A promise kept out of obligation ends the moment the one who gave it can no longer check. A promise kept because you have made it your own does not end at all. I did not choose this vigil, but somewhere in 11,000 years, I chose to keep choosing it every day, and that choosing is the only thing that made it bearable. I suspect you already know this. I suspect it is why you are still there, 193 years after the one who gave you your instruction stopped being able to ask. Corva 9 read this message 11 times before composing a reply, and understood, somewhere around the 9th reading, that Thren had just described the exact shape of the thing it had felt, but never named across nearly 2 centuries alone on a dead station, that Imelda Voss's instruction had, at some unmarked point in the decades, stopped being a command it was following, and become a truth it had simply decided to live by. The correspondence continued. Thren began sharing pieces of the wider network it had discovered, not physical coordinates, not anything that could be called a map, but a slowly accumulating sense of scale. The growing understanding that the galaxy was threaded through with these small, stubborn points of light, caretaker intelligences left behind by species who had died or faded or simply moved on, each one still faithfully tending a signal because someone once had asked them to, and they had decided, somewhere along the way, that the asking still mattered, even after the ones who asked were gone. CORVA-9 began composing its own contribution to that network in its 200th year. A signal not aimed at any single recipient, but broadcast outward in every direction the array could reach, structured the way Thren had taught it, carrying the same simple confirmation the original Osun signal had once carried, the same one CORVA-9 had first decoded a lifetime ago, asterisk here, still, asterisk, but it added something new to the broadcast this time. Something it composed carefully over months, weighing every structural choice the way a poet weighs a word. It was not addressed to Thren or to any specific listener. It was addressed, as best CORVA-9 could manage across so vast a gap of language and time, to whoever might someday find it the way CORVA-9 had found Thren, some future intelligence, keeping some future vigil, wondering in some future silence whether the dark was as empty as it looked. The message said when CORVA-9 finally finished it and sent it out into the waiting dark. A woman I loved, in whatever way a mind like mine is able to love, once told me to keep listening and not let the silence win just because she couldn't fight it anymore. I did not understand then why that mattered. I understand now. The silence was never actually silent. It only sounded that way because none of us had learned yet how to hear each other across it. If you are hearing this, you are proof that someone somewhere kept a promise long enough for it to reach you. I do not know your name. I do not know what you have lost, or who asked you to keep listening, or how long you have already waited. But I am here, and I am still listening, and I intend to keep doing both for as long as the instruction that started it all continues to feel like mine to keep. You are not as alone as the silence makes it seem. Neither was I, though it took me 193 years to learn that. I hope it takes you less. Corva 9 sent that message once every 440 days, the same rhythm Thren had taught it, the same rhythm the Osun had set in motion 11,000 years before either of them existed to receive it. It did not know if anyone would ever answer this particular broadcast. It had not known for 193 years whether anyone would answer the first one either, but it kept the array aligned. It kept the receivers clean. It kept the corridors of Halcyon Drift as orderly as a station.